So yesterday was announced that Blake Masters, the former GOP nominee for Senate in 2022, is preparing another Senate bid, this time for Krysten Sinema's seat in 2024. So we're going to talk about what this means for the GOP's chances of retaking the Senate in 2024, what a potential three-person race with Masters, Gallego, and Sinema could look like, and then also what this could mean for the primary as well, which we'll probably cover before we get into the general election stuff. And then we'll also look at some previous election results regarding Arizona and what Republicans' chances are there. So we're going to get into all of that in just a second. But first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So Blake Masters is the failed GOP candidate from 2022. He lost his bid against Mark Kelly by around 5 points. We take a look. Wikipedia has the better numbers here. But this was a pretty crushing blow to the Republican Party, since this was one of the seats they were counting on flipping in order to take back the Senate. Now, most people, this was one of the seats that was more in the lean Democratic category. I think a lot of people weren't really surprised that Blake Masters lost, but it really was the margin by which he lost. I mean, he lost by almost 5 points. Meanwhile, you have Kari Lake on the same ballot, only losing by less than a point. So if we take a look at the general election polling here, the final aggregates, FiveThirtyEight had Kelly at 1.5. 270 had Kelly at 1.3, and then RCP actually had Masters leading. And I incorrectly said that Masters would flip this seat very narrowly based on the trajectory the polling was telling us. Obviously, we all know the polling was very, very wrong in the 2022 midterm cycle, so that was definitely part of it. But regardless, Masters massively underperformed expectations, and he had all the big endorsements. He had Trump's endorsement, he had Republicans from all around the political spectrum endorsing him. This was a seat, again, that Republicans really needed to win to take back the Senate, and ultimately he fell short. Now, Mark Kelly was a popular incumbent. He's an astronaut. He's somebody who certainly gets sort of the sympathy factor. His wife, Gabby Giffords, was shot. He's very big into gun control, just like she was. So this really was a tough race for Republicans to win. Mark Kelly, already being the incumbent, was able to raise a lot of money. He had this very moderate persona about him, even if he did vote in line with the Democratic Party 90% of the time. So this was always going to be a tough race for Republicans to win, and ultimately they fell short. Now, fast forward to 2024, Republicans have a pretty bad bench, in my opinion, for Senate. You've got Kari Lake potentially running. I think that's going to be a disaster. We could talk about that in another video, because Kari Lake essentially bankrupted the Arizona GOP with all of her sham lawsuits and, phony recounts and all that stuff. So, she was taking away millions of dollars that could have otherwise gone to the Arizona GOP, all for these failed efforts that, in my opinion, she knew weren't going to go anywhere anyway. So she was really just drawing away all this money and cash and resources away from the Arizona GOP, which already puts them in a weaker position going into 2024. Now, Doug Ducey said he wasn't going to run. That's not surprising, since he had a pretty public falling out with Donald Trump after 2020. Ducey was somebody that before 2020 was expected to run for Senate in 2022, and he probably would have won. I mean, given the fact that he was fairly popular at the time, he won re-election by a massive margin against a progressive Democrat, and, going up against even an incumbent, I think he would have been a super strong candidate, since he had pretty high favorables among independents and, the types of people that Republicans need to actually win statewide in Arizona. Because Arizona, I still think, is a plurality independent or non-affiliated state when it comes to voting. So, Republicans have won their elections in the past because they've been able to win over these independents. That's not really the case anymore, especially in the era of Trump. But you have Kari Lake, you have Abe Hamadeh, who said he wouldn't run if Lake runs. So, he's another one that he had a really close race for Attorney General. His race was the closest statewide race, I believe, and he lost very, very narrowly to the Democrat. Of course, he was crying fraud in that as well, just like Kari Lake. And that's another reason why I think both these candidates are very weak. They've made their entire crux of their campaign about election fraud and the fact that they were robbed of their previous elections. And that's not really a message voters care about, especially when you don't have evidence to back it up and you've been laughed out of court a number of times. So, any candidate running on election denialism is going to get destroyed in 2024. It's one of the reasons why I think Trump's also in such a weak position in the general. Now, Trump's a bit different because he's a bit more savvy than these other Republicans, but I certainly think in the case of Lake and Hamadeh, they're just going to end up losing again, almost guaranteed. Now, Blake Masters, look, he doesn't have the best track record. Again, he lost by 5 points, but he certainly is better, in my opinion, than Lake, because even though Lake had a much closer result, Blake Masters has, in my opinion, a much better image. He kind of gracefully conceded when he lost to Mark Kelly. Very unlike what Kari Lake did. Of course, she made a whole fuss about, Katie Hobbs being illegitimate, all these lawsuits that were never going to go anywhere. And that's her entire identity now. So I think she's going to be viewed much more as an extreme pariah candidate, somebody that people aren't going to want to vote for. Independents are going to be terrified of her. And she's not really going to go anywhere. Blake Masters, I think, would do better, in my opinion, than Kari Lake. Now, what makes the dynamics of the Arizona Senate race this time around so interesting is that we're potentially looking at a three-person matchup. You've got Ruben Gallego, who's, Democratic congressman, super, super left-wing. You've got Kari Lake, who's really just embedded herself in MAGA. You have Blake Masters, who, again, it all depends on who wins the primary, but it could be Blake Masters or Kari Lake at this point in time, unless you have Mark Lamb. But Mark Lamb's also said a lot of stuff about the 2020 election that I really think is going to hurt him. And also, he really can't raise any money. He hasn't really raised any significant money since he's announced. I mean, $600,000 is a pretty low amount at this point in time, especially since if somebody like Masters or Lake were to jump in, they'd probably be in the millions already. And you're going to need a lot of money to beat somebody like Ruben Gallego, especially when you have somebody like Sinema potentially siphoning off votes away from the Republican candidate, which is probably what she's going to do. Because, again, Krysten Sinema is more popular among Republicans than she is Democrats, which was her former party. And she still caucuses with the Democratic Party. So it's going to be really tough, I think, for the GOP to actually flip this Senate seat, even with Sinema in the race, just because they really don't have a good slate of candidates. Juan Ciscomani would have been a very strong candidate, although he's a freshman congressman, so I didn't expect him to run. Karen Taylor Robeson would have been a better candidate, although she really should have won the gubernatorial primary. She'd probably be governor right now. And, potentially that could have helped Blake Masters as well. You've got Kelly Ward. Thankfully, she's not running. She would have been a very bad choice for the GOP. But we really don't have great options on the Republican side. And obviously, Ruben Gallego, yes, he's a very progressive Democrat. But honestly, Arizona's a purple state that's starting to lean a lot more blue. I mean, look how much money Ruben Gallego's raised. Mark Lamb only has 10% of what Ruben Gallego was able to raise since June 30th. So, as of June 30th, rather. So, this is going to be a massive uphill to climb because Democrats have the advantage of getting lots of big money from the coastal areas. Republicans don't have that anymore. They've lost a lot of the big donors, especially in the era of Trump. Fundraising has been a massive issue because a lot of the Republican fundraising goes to Donald Trump directly. And, he puts that towards his legal fees and his own personal things. And he's not really helping out the rest of the candidates in that regard. So looking ahead at 2024, Masters running, it's not great for Republicans, but it's certainly not the worst thing because honestly, in a primary between Masters and Lake, if you're a Republican, you want Masters to win because he at least has more of a chance. He's not viewed as, sort of fringe and psychotic in the way that Kari Lake is viewed by average voters. And it's kind of interesting because you're sort of seeing a rift in MAGA now with a lot of MAGA influencers supporting Blake Masters, and then you've also got a lot supporting Lake as well. So you really have like this split within MAGA because they were both endorsed by Donald Trump in 2022. Masters is definitely more the polished candidate, the more mainstream candidate. He didn't really run the best campaign back in 2022, but he certainly is a better choice than Kari Lake, who, again, her entire campaign message was election fraud. But, she ran a better campaign in the general in 2022. At least she was talking about other issues. But now her entire campaign is going to be about, Donald Trump worship and essentially the fact that she had her last race stolen. And, it's kind of funny when people point out why she's running for the Senate now, even though she's supposedly the governor of Arizona or trying to be the governor of Arizona. It seems like she'll just jump from one office to the other and just bleed all the donation money dry and then move on to the next. So, obviously, if you're a Republican, you want Blake Masters to be the nominee out of him and Kari Lake. Ideally, though, there'd be another candidate that sort of benefits from a vote split of MAGA potentially between Masters and Lake that wins the primary. But again, a three-person race is really going to be interesting to see because we really haven't had a high-profile third-party candidate run in quite a long time. I mean, in some of the polls, Sinema's actually beating the Republican candidate, but ultimately, I don't think Sinema has much of a chance unless it really does go down to the wire with these other two candidates. I mean, they'd all have to get around 30-something%. So far, Sinema's only polling around 28%. And obviously, she's not going to have the endorsement of Democrats this time around, so she really doesn't have the backing of any major party. She is an independent, so it is hard for independents to break through, obviously, in the American system, but, I think you're going to see a lot of people, if Lake's the nominee, and potentially even Masters, but especially Lake, vote for Sinema rather than the Republican nominee, because quite frankly, Sinema has done a lot for Republicans in the sense that she stalled a lot of Biden's agenda purely by voting against it. She saved the filibuster. She helped tank Build Back Better. So, you have a lot of things where Sinema's in the good graces of some Republican voters, and she does appear to be a moderate based on taking those strong stances. I mean, and it cost her a lot. She basically had to leave the Democratic Party because she was losing by quite a lot in primary polling against Gallego and other Democrats. So, looking ahead at 2024, obviously we have a long time away, but as of right now, this definitely looks like a race where the Democrats are going to be favored. I mean, if we take a look back at 2022, Republicans won some of the statewide races. In fact, Republicans flipped the superintendent of public instruction, and yet Democrats won all the races, in my opinion, that mattered a lot. They won the governorship, they won the Senate, and they came very close to flipping the state legislature, and that's something potentially in 2024 they could possibly flip one of the houses. I'm not quite sure how long the terms are, but I think the state house might be 2 years. So they could potentially flip that as well if Republicans have a really bad night. But this is really the roadmap to winning as a Republican in Arizona if you're going to lose Maricopa County. Kathy Hoffman won Maricopa County by 2 points. But Tom Horne did just well enough in the rest of the state to sort of offset the fact that the Democrat had won Maricopa County. I mean, if a Republican wins Maricopa County in our existing political paradigm, with a lot of the rural areas being very red, they're almost guaranteed to win the state. But so far, we've had no Republican win Maricopa County in 2022 besides Kimberly Yee, who I think would be the strongest candidate in the general by far, but I don't know if she's really interested. I think potentially she's more interested in running for governor, but she won by a massive margin statewide, while all the other statewide Republicans did very poorly, of course, minus Tom Horne, who actually ended up flipping a seat. But Kimberly Yee was able to win re-election by over 11 points, and she won Maricopa County by 10 points. This is certainly a Republican that has shown that they can win not just rural areas, but the suburbs as well. And granted, you could argue that this is a lower ballot race. This isn't a race people are paying attention to more. But nonetheless, Kimberly Yee is probably Republicans' best chance at this point in time to actually flipping this Senate seat. Because if Republicans really want to have a working majority in the Senate, they're going to probably want to flip Arizona. They don't need Arizona. They can win the Senate through Montana, Ohio, and West Virginia. But obviously having Arizona as a nice buffer state for, 2026 would be good for Republicans. But, as of right now, it seems very likely that Democrats are probably going to hold on to this seat if trends continue, especially since Republicans continue to fail at messaging to suburban voters, in the era of Trump, essentially. And if Trump's on the ballot too, I can guarantee you almost that he'll probably lose Arizona, and the Republican nominee for Senate will also lose. Anyway, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.